Good afternoon, everybody. So today we're going to be talking through the journey to achieving CMMC, presented by myself, Josh Oslin, Principal Architect here at Coretek Services. And also along for the ride with me is Philip Jones, Solution Architect here at Coretek Services.
Hello, everyone.
So just a quick bio on myself. Over 15 years of security, IT, data privacy, and compliance experience and leadership, 5+ years architecture and solutioning experience. I have been working in over 20 industry verticals, cybersecurity incident response and recovery advisor, also DevOps thought leader and innovation champion here at Coretek Services as well. So getting into our use case overview, we're going to be covering a client-specific use case here, but kind of reaching into some of the breadth and underlying components in our framework and structure for approaching CMMC as a deliverable and how we can help achieve business compliance within the CMMC orchestration and make sure that the architect matches the controls and getting into a holistic approach for CMMC. So use case code name GovMed Inc. Essentially, they are working with us to posture their cybersecurity to be able to meet the CMMC regulations for their DoD contract. They are a services provider in the healthcare vertical for DoD. They leverage an on-premises deployment to be able to achieve their CMMC requirements today, and they have essentially contracted us to architect, deploy, and then support a cloud-first strategy around CMMC to augment their current workload and lift and shift into the cloud based on CMMC compliant architecture. So we have an approach of a blended CAF of Coretek's own making. It's a CAF associated and aligned with the CMMC controls and control families. We then bring in M365, G365 to be able to accommodate any other ancillary controls and measures to be able to report on, show, and deliver full through and through CMMC architecture. And then in this use case, we are leveraging Citrix as a way for this enterprise to be able to use this enclave. So holistically, it is an enclave, but it is their entire enterprise wide. So their all business practices and everything for this client essentially runs through this CMMC compliant environment. We perform due diligence to be able to go through and assess their current architecture and their approach to achieving CMMC compliance, and then went through and validated with all of their vendors how we would be able to enhance, augment, and bring that into an Azure first model, and then plan out a lift and shift migration from on-premises servers into Azure. They will have a vendor for a private cloud hosting for their EMR, and then vendor to vendor VoIP telephony services, and then Citrix DAS. So getting into some of the key business and technical challenges, as identified, Coretek did perform due diligence and we developed a well-architected framework. So that way, for example, we can meet the CMMC controls. An example control for CMMC 2.0 L2, AC L2 3111. So we are looking at controlling the mapping and limit of system access to authorized users. This covers kind of a gamut of services that Microsoft can bring to the table. Primary would be Azure Active Directory, RBAC, and Intune or Microsoft Endpoint Manager. And then there is a handful of secondary services that go along with it, as listed here: MIP, conditional access, lockbox, PIM. So getting into creating the plan. We held 20 plus discovery sessions with the client, with their parent company, with their vendors to assess their current environment, what their business needs are, and then pull together a plan of approach with the well-architected framework and the Coretek specific CAF approach to CMMC. We provided an assessment, gauge feasibility, and then through the discovery sessions, produced an architecture for their overall environment and infrastructure, how we would govern said environment, pulled together network architecture so that way we could put together the mapping of traffic patterns and then secure the perimeter with boundary firewalls and do a segmented isolated network first approach and a whitelist only model, put together identity patterns and approach to meet a 3-tier identity architecture, what we would do for a strategy around update management, how monitoring and alerting would go through, how we would augment that monitoring and alerting with our MSSP practice from a SOC perspective, what the environment would entail from a backup and discovery platform and approach, leveraging this in a effectively highly active, but with ASR where it makes sense from an Azure Site Recovery standpoint, and then all the way through from a security standpoint with a SIM, endpoint protection, and then as stated, SOC. We are also enhancing the third-party private cloud with our controls and enforcement on their environment, leveraging Azure Arc to extend into that third-party private cloud data center, be able to augment and collect all of their logs and then feed that into Sentinel as a SIM, and then enforce all of our controls as well on the telecom provider for telephony to fall under the same CMMC compliant architecture.
Josh, I have a quick question for you from the audience. If I have a SOC or an MSSP provider, do they fall under CMMC scope?
Yes, they would. So with the CMMC plans coming out for revision, the third-party vendors that would be in place from a MSSP SOC perspective will also need to be CMMC compliant because they are viewed as an extension of the entity, and as part of the provider, they would need to fall under the same compliance regulations.
Thank you. No other questions at this time.
Okay, perfect. So continuing on, getting into our deployment process, it is iterative. We do have steps to achieving compliance. And to summarize this, we break it out into 4 stages. So that way we can identify regulatory requirements, set up a plan around them, include that into our architecture and our plan for delivery, and our high-level architecture framework to then be transposed into the low-level architecture based on services and how we can achieve that compliance. So we use Compliance Manager to assess and plan in certain those scenarios where Compliance Manager may not be able to get into a full-scale deployment prior to needing to get into the iterative approach, is the reason why we also have our due diligence approach from an architecture standpoint and going through essentially interviewing the required parties from the client side and then putting together a remediation plan for any identified gaps prior to bringing any services out into what would be our secure enclave that we would be instantiating. Stage 2 is really getting into content and how we identify, tag, and put requirements out there specifically for DLP policies, working with Microsoft Purview to enhance tagging on, for example, email, and what we would have for CMMC tagged data, giving an example of CUI, classified, unclassified data, if you will, and getting into how that would be tagged, what the policies would look like from a media protection standpoint to make sure that there isn't any mishandling of any potential classified or unclassified data. Getting into stage 3, we would get into the data lifecycle management, how we would handle compliance around data storage, getting into some of the encryption that would be required, or for services that would be essentially transitioning such data. We would want to make sure that we had FIPS compliant deployments and making sure that we are hitting all of the controls required. So getting into isolation based on controls, network segmentation based on whitelist policy. So server A wouldn't be able to talk to server B unless otherwise explicitly whitelisted within the framework to prevent any mishandling of any data based on a well-architected framework. Getting into container labeling, automatic mandatory labeling, and then truly stricter DLP policies, so that way it is fully enforced and not just in a alert methodology, and then we reassess compliance. Stage 4, leveraging Sentinel. We would want to build reports, make sure that we're continuously assessing and providing live feedback on the environment, enforcing policy from a standpoint of non-negotiable to prevent drift from compliance and the well-architected framework, using Compliance Manager to identify and remediate any gaps that may occur, otherwise keeping to the initially staged architecture and deployment. So getting into a use case timeline, enterprise-wide compliance, and so this is, as stated, on a full-scale enterprise. The client's entire business operates out of CMMC compliance. So this could be a little bit longer of a timeline. We can talk through the fact that while using native Azure services only, we could condense some of these timelines, but based on this client's use case and requirements, there is the need for Citrix, and with the need for Citrix, we are augmenting the service with a Palo Alto deployment as well. So getting into a little bit more of a full-scale enterprise-wide, depending on use case or the contract stipulations, we could see a smaller enclave being in use if it's just a branch of a client environment where they could leverage Azure Firewall, they could leverage native AVD. It depends on the use case of the data, how the data would need to be protected, leveraged, and accessed. So, for example, on a smaller use case, if it's a web app that's purely manipulating some PII or CUI data, that would fall under that contract, and it's not every entity of the business or every user that they have out there that would be working in this enclave. It's just a handful. It could be a small enclave with just a handful of access VMs to be able to get in and do their job, and then have that completely segmented and walled off from their commercial entity, if that's the way that that client was structured. So just kind of diving into what we're doing with this client specifically, getting into some of the pre-work. Our pre-work was largely enhanced around how we would do our due diligence assessment of their current design, refactoring any of their current services that they would have on premises today that may not be a good fit for Azure, for example, they were leveraging a traditional on-premises Exchange environment, and that was locked down to specific versioning, which had their Office client locked down to specific versioning as well, and was preventing things like modern level authentication being leveraged on their Office client. So we wanted to work on how we would refactor that, get them into a GCC high compliant M365 Exchange Online environment, be able to get them to leverage MLA, be able to get them to still have a seamless SSO experience, and how that would work from a underlying MFA required access standpoint and keeping within the CMMC boundary of controls to prevent any unauthorized access. So essentially, we complete a documentation repository from a high level to low level architecture, a full running CAF document that is a living, breathing document for the environment, getting into evidence for how we would be able to provide that for any SSP documentation, for any POAMs, and underlying pre-attestation documentation that would be required from a client standpoint. We can assist in creating some of those materials as well. So we have a build path that consists of GCC high landing zone being deployed within Azure and M365, any configuration updates, any operations onboarding. And we have, as stated, base AVD deployed or Citrix GCC high DAS implementation that would be required to be able to get into this environment. And then through that, there would be application testing, a UAT experience, validation of the users being able to, as is, complete their job duties from start to finish, going through based on UAT, bouncing everything off our CMMC configuration checklist, our controls, and then once we're getting the sign off ready to retire, we would do so. So we have a deploy and configure GC365 operations. We do this from a highly orchestrated DevOps first mentality, and that way we can report on any drift and enforce compliance, enforce regulatory controls to be non-negotiable on the environment. Otherwise, the deployment will be highly scrutinized, required to go through security controls, compliances, and validation to be able to augment new services within the environment and prevent any potential unauthorized access. So leveraging, in this instance, a Teams deployment and configuration, they would be leveraging Teams with a SIP pass-through, SharePoint and OneDrive for data housing and keeping everything into a DLP level configuration with tagging, O365 migration to kick off as well, post landing zone delivery and UAT of customer access into the enclave. So we would stage this out in a way that it is a rolling and iterative process. Current mail flow wouldn't be cut over to work effort on their on-premises enclave. It would be all in a transitional stage tiered approach to be able to keep business continuity while enhancing any compliance or controls along the way and documenting as we go, and getting into a business user testing outside of IT functional testing and smoke testing. Defender configuration being crucial throughout. So within the Azure environment, we would leverage Defender for Cloud and the regulatory and compliance built-in framework that it brings to the table, while also leveraging the synthetic onboarding for resources in Defender for Cloud to come over into Microsoft Defender for Endpoint to be able to do assessments and any enhanced regulatory and compliance configurations. Coretek has developed a process throughout this to leverage Azure policy as well to enhance STIG compliance and be able to report on STIG compliance and keep that in a non-driftable format. So it's an enforced policy structure to keep away from any potential manipulation locally that is delivered in a DevOps first mentality as well. And then we get into any investigation response playbooks, bringing on our MSSP SOC practice, getting in fine tuning, any alerting, any structure from a SIM standpoint, our Coretek straightforward approach to SOC SIM and how we would onboard a client into that, be able to seamlessly integrate with any IT staff that would be there from a security standpoint, and what a call tree would look like and go forward strategy for communications through and through. Our Sentinel deployment and configuration is all based off of that. And what we would do, this would be a customer focused Sentinel deployment though. So if a client did have their own SOC or internal resources that would be handling that, that would be something that we would transition and hand off and be able to work with them on that based off of our baseline framework and architecture that we would bring to the table. And so from that approach, we get into a holistic timeline here, start to finish, on what a well-architected CMMC compliant enclave would look like in Azure. Here's our initial architecture at a high level. This is somewhat of a busy slide, but it does encompass what it does entail to be able to get into a CMMC compliant architecture and framework. So based on the way that we would approach our Azure landing zone, we have a management group and subscription configuration architecture where we would apply our CMMC controls, regulatory and compliance policies, the Coretek custom configurations that we would use for dashboard building and creation of reporting on said policies, and the framework there to enhance STIG enforcement and keeping things into a living, breathing entity that is also kept away from drift as much as humanly possible. We do have a platform managed services DevOps team that will manage the DevOps framework and architecture leverage to deploy. So these are tried true processes that we are well versed at. Getting into the way that we would break out our subscriptions at a high level, we would do an identity subscription to keep identity as secure as humanly possible, keeping things in a framework and architecture that isolates and segments based on use case, keep it straightforward, and also make sure that from an access standpoint, access being provisioned to the support staff or being provisioned from a user perspective are two different things. They're clearly isolated. It's all based on role, job function, and what is required to be able to do that. And as stated previously, in a 3-tier account architecture. So T0, Tier 1, Tier 2, all identified based on services and the need to be able to do business functions versus support and administrative functions. Getting into what we would structure out from a management subscription, how we would manage the environment, how we structure our governance and enforcement, and then breaking that out into a connectivity subscription, which would be in a hub and spoke model from a VNet perspective as well. And that way, in a hybrid style environment like this is, we would be able to have some of the fundamental underlying pieces that would be part of the CMMC enclave that would exist as part of this customer's enterprise, be able to get into this environment from a highly secure, highly scrutinized methodology. In this instance, we would be passing through printers. They have the capabilities of printing in a secure location, and then they have capabilities of scanning data into the EMR. And that is done from a secluded, caged environment, IDF closet, the rack and stack that is dedicated specifically for the CMMC workloads. And then we get into our Citrix VDA subscription, where our Citrix architecture would live from a VDA standpoint. Client access devices, i.e. when a user goes to govmed.com and hits their Citrix landing zone page, they would then come in through an MFA-enabled Citrix HDX protocol into their VDA session. This is where that would live. Their applications for job function would live within the Citrix enclave, and they would be able to do their day-to-day capabilities from here as well. An enhancement for non-user personnel accessing from an administrative standpoint would come in from Citrix first. A break glass of Bastion could be leveraged in a BCDR style strategy to be able to troubleshoot if needed. And then we get into our Citrix shared services subscription, and this is where we would put user profiles in a storage container. This is where we would put some of the Citrix infrastructure, storefront, cloud connectors, ADCs, and the ADCs would be broken off into a DMZ style, since it would have a public-facing NAT to then be highly scrutinized by the Palo architecture. And then getting into what we would do from Azure AD conditional access, i.e. Microsoft Entra conditional access. We have very explicit conditional access policies in a very rigid format and the most specific wins. So in this model, we would be looking at source, destination, what their authentication pattern looks like, and then enforcing and making sure that MFA protocols are being met and achieved. Getting into our Microsoft Sentinel and Microsoft Defender XDR strategy with a zero trust under the hood methodology with enhancements based off CMMC media protection controls as well. And then we cover some of Microsoft's zero trust deployment stack and what that would actually look like to protect and govern sensitive data, defend against threats, and then a zero trust foundation to be able to enhance with any CMMC controls on top of that to provide a straightforward baseline and Microsoft-centric approach. So getting into some of the key components, Azure first, as
Josh,
that is where...
Before you jump into the Azure section, we actually have a two-part question. Can I achieve a CMMC compliance with an on-prem or hybrid environment? And the second part of that question is, can the Microsoft solutions protect on-prem components as well? Now, before you answer that question, a lot of what you've talked about is the Azure, environment and framework, and you're going to dive more into that in a second. Being able to move that workload into Azure because it's easier to migrate into and protect a new workload than it is to do an on-prem or a full workload for a full environment existing. But again, just to recap the question, it was, can I achieve CMMC clients with on-prem or hybrid? And then the second part of that was, can I use that same Microsoft security stack to protect it?
So the answer to both in summary is yes. What we would do from that approach is, as part of due diligence, go through and identify the use case of what would be coming from a hybrid deployment, identifying and scrutinizing how that would then connect into the Azure environment and what data would live where, how that data is protected within transit, and what we would need to do from a control standpoint to keep that data in a protected format from a controlled, classified, unclassified data perspective, and what that would actually look like from the standpoint of inception into the Microsoft-centric stack. So being able to extend Microsoft Defender for Endpoint on premises, We would be able to also extend and cover IoT devices, i.e. network hardware, printers, switches, things of that nature, to be able to achieve compliance from that standpoint as well. So based on the UK use case, we would define what it would actually look like from a how is the data needed to be handled, what is the extension of the enclave look like into a hybrid model, and then we would fit that into a Microsoft-centric first approach, and then any gaps or analysis that would be required, we would bring to the table. However, from our experience, we are able to achieve compliance in a hybrid model with a Microsoft-centric approach. Does that? Okay.
That should answer the question. If there's any more, I'll let you know.
Perfect. Thank you. So getting into our first key component, Azure. As stated, we start with a landing zone topology based off of Microsoft CAF, which is a cloud adoption framework. It is a guide that we leverage to be able to instantiate, based off best practices and Microsoft principles, what a landing zone would look like based on use case and what the client has from a regulatory and compliance framework requirement. And then we have a Coretek based approach to that to be able to marry in CMMC into the CAF approach. So that way, while going through a CAF, it doesn't go through, let's say, a CAF and then a security review. The security review is ongoing and always a part of the CAF process that we have developed here. And that way, our approach is CMMC first and foremost all the way through. So our CAF experts being trained in CMMC approach and what that looks like from a delivery standpoint to be able to assess. Now we do have our RPs that would want to make sure and validate, and we would want to also put that against our controls and our well-architected framework structure to be able to make sure that any one-off configuration or anything that comes along that is potentially non-standard would be well documented in a way. If there was any exemptions required, that could be documented to put it into any security control practices and documents. And that way, from the standpoint of getting into the landing zone, it is CMMC first as part of the architecture and not an afterthought after the fact, and then you have to come in and true up. We lead with what it is as a requirement to be able to achieve CMMC compliance. So getting into some of the key components that help us do that from the Azure standpoint, Microsoft has a CMMC L3 blueprint that we like to leverage as our baseline, and then we have our enhancements that Coretek has developed, leveraging and marrying in policy to enforce STIG compliance, any enhancements beyond CMMC, any deny policies on a service that would not fall under a CMMC compliant deployment. And that way, from a delivery and orchestration standpoint, the controls are being enforced at the management group layer, and we are not allowing for any drift. It also brings in real-time reporting on what the actual infrastructure looks like, and we get into a continuous monitoring of compliance versus getting into a potential weekly tenable assessment of the environment, for example. And that way, from a security focus standpoint, any practitioners would be able to come out and check based off the dashboards and what policy is reporting on the health of the current environment and what that looks like based on the controls that were enforced in the beginning and the build of the landing zone. We use Defender for Cloud to be able to enforce regulatory compliance as well as synthetic onboarding into Microsoft Defender for Endpoint for assessments, leveraging Sentinel for Microsoft CMMC workbooks with any Coretek enhancements to develop dashboards for regulatory and compliance. And that way, there is multiple different ways that a practitioner would be able to come out here and check and pull together an attestation or go through a spot audit and be able to provide compelling evidence to an auditor and what that looks like based on just logging into the dashboard and looking at the health of the environment. Getting into a technical value delivered, essentially a baseline that's based off audit and accountability to govern a highly orchestrated and drift diverse configuration, rigid deployment practices. We want to avoid any drift on configuration from what is our compliant architecture. And that way, from a point of delivering inception into operationalizing the environment, we don't have any services that are rolled out as part of an iterative approach that would then come in as a non-compliant service that need to be remediated after the fact. It is highly controlled on the onset, so that way when services are integrated, they meet the required controls to be able to pass policy, to be able to be compliant. And then, as an example, controls addressed. We're calling out the control families here because this is wide sweeping, and the way that we approach our controls are holistic. And then we develop a compliancy framework, which would lead into a controls matrix, a shared responsibility matrix, and what that looks like from a well-architected delivery of client services. Key component for G365, we get into our technology overview. We evaluate, assess, plan, and execute the GC365 deployment with an augmentation of the Azure GCC High Landing Zone, leveraging under the hood Microsoft Zero Trust Framework as a strategic baseline, and then we enhance based on the CMMC controls to be able to achieve complete compliance, getting an organization from their business use case into a highly orchestrated IT workload that meets compliance and controls for ultimate protection of that contract and what that looks like from a DoD perspective. Getting into some of the key components leveraged there, we have the M365 apps with Office, providing access into Mailbox, leveraging Teams, leveraging OneDrive, security compliance. As stated, Exchange Online, SharePoint, and OneDrive as well, and all of our detailed DLP policies that would go along with that for data protection enforcement, and then getting into purview and compliance assessments to be able to enforce tagging and ensure compliance and reporting for CMMC. Our technical value delivered would be a baseline CMMC framework with audit and accountability to be able to achieve the governance required and highly orchestrate that environment in a drift diverse configuration as well. We do leverage things like M365 with a Coretek flavor for M365 DSC to be able to highly orchestrate that in a way where it is implemented and then tested, tried, and prevented from drift. Once again, we are addressing the control families because it's not just one control. There is a breadth of controls, and there's a primary service and a secondary service that Microsoft has put together on their control mapping. So with a Coretek enhancement based off of that and bringing in and tying the controls to any non-Microsoft applications or security measures, for example, Palo Alto, the controls are wide sweeping. So from this, we have our design decisions, what that would actually look like and how we would be deploying it in a way that would be meeting the controls to provide straightforward architecture and as built documentation, which would lead well to any attestations, assessments, going through any security surveillance and what that looks like to be able to actually achieve your compliances. And then in this client specific use case, we do have the key component of Citrix. As stated earlier, we would be able to leverage native AVD if we wanted to go with an Azure first model. And if it was a smaller enclave that didn't require some of the Citrix enhancements from a protocol standpoint like HDX and ICA, then absolutely Microsoft first approach would work no problem, and we would deploy in the same way. But in this use case, we're calling out a GCC Citrix DAS tenant, leveraging that in a way where we can provide access to the end users into the enclave in a highly rigid, highly scrutinized network architecture. So that way it is in a whitelist segmented framework, and packet flow is highly segmented based off of the Palo Alto architecture that we would put out there in a object-oriented policy configuration with a whitelist approach, and getting into Citrix being able to provide a gateway that is FIPS compliant, meeting MFA requirements, and also best practices around STIG and any STIG enhancements that would be required for our gold image and VDA creation. Leveraging Citrix FAS integration for MFA requirements. We get into a highly scrutinized CERT-based user authentication, which will allow the use of Microsoft Authenticator at the endpoint when they log into the Citrix gateway, and then being able to provide that into the VDA and translate from SAML into a VDA-friendly authentication methodology. Getting into some of the technical value delivered there, what we're doing is providing a perimeter defense and then a highly scrutinized entry into the CMMC enclave, and doing this from a active-active deployment strategy. So that way, if region A of Azure goes down, region B takes over, and Citrix is still available for the users to be able to get in and leverage their applications and be able to do their use case required for the DoD contract. And then once again, this is all based off of the control families and not just any specific control. It is wide sweeping throughout all of the CMMC control architecture and what that is a requirement for. And with this approach, based on what we're seeing, is being able to have a straightforward baseline to enhance CMMC compliance and achievement of CMMC certification for that DoD contract holder. So key component D, real-time configuration assessment. So some of this is based off of what Microsoft brings to the table for policy compliance, and Coretek has developed custom policy structure where we can bring in the continuous reporting from the Azure CMMC blueprint, but also Coretek's custom configuration for custom policy definitions that would do STIG enforcement, STIG assessment, and making sure that we are throughout all the way, all of CMMC controls enforcing compliance to the point where we even have key vault policies out there. We have Azure disk encryption policies out there, and what we're doing from a highly scrutinized standpoint to keep these dashboards current and fresh, and then continuously exporting. So leveraging some of the continuous export framework, we would be able to provide that to the client's security department, so that way they can continue to see real time what that looks like from a compliance standpoint. And they also get the same level of alerting that our SOC would if there is any drift. And then based on the fact that these are an enforcement, we would take any drift and discard changes unless put through a proven release strategy to allow for that to be onboarded within the environment and prevent any non-compliant configurations from being rolled out, to ultimately protect our controlled data. So from a classified, unclassified data, or even a classified data, the way that it would be out there, PII, things of that nature, we're going to want to make sure that our architecture under the hood is meeting compliance across the board. Getting into the finalized architecture and not the high level architecture, as you can see, we're augmenting based off of the initial high level architecture. We're bringing in the Citrix components, what that looks like, how we're doing a highly scrutinized authentication pattern to be able to get into Citrix, where Citrix brings to the table their platform services and what that looks like. And from the standpoint of Citrix and GCC High, that is also based off of under the hood at Citrix. Microsoft Azure GCC High is where they would have those services. So if it works for Citrix and it works for Microsoft, it's going to work for Coretek and it's going to work for you as well. Getting into the standpoint of how we get this from start to finish is through this iterative process that we've been talking through here today, and then bringing the enhancements in and keeping our zero trust framework from an M365 G365 standpoint, all based off of our CAF architecture, all based off of our conditional access policies and zero trust framework. This then enforces all of the controls upon Citrix and how they get into the environment, how we have secured the perimeter, and how a business would be able to do the same thing with AVD instead of Citrix. And that way it's not a one size fits all shoe, but we do have a holistic baseline framework that would be able to be manipulated to be able to be spread across multiple different platforms and preferences for approach. So operationalizing the environment, what we have done here at Coretek is strategically mapped CMMC controls with a shared responsibility matrix to operationalize supporting the CMMC enclave, getting into a markdown based document format in a certain regard that leads well to our DevOps practice. And as you can see from an example on the side here, we would provide a description what the control is, what frameworks that it needs to be applied to from an Azure perspective, from an M365 perspective, from a GitHub perspective, and then we marry into that what the configuration under the hood would look like, and then what customer responsibility would look like. And depending on whether Coretek is your MSP, MSSP, we could be responsible here instead of customer. All depends on if we're doing professional services or professional services and managed support after the fact. But getting into the standpoint where a client would be able to work with us, get a well-architected CMMC enclave, operationalize that into holistic support patterns, whether it be within their support structure or whether it be within Coretek-based support structure, it will be married from architecture into delivery, into support and ongoing maintenance and care and feeding of the environment. And then achieving compliance. So putting together a go forward plan, assessing current state, conduct a self-assessment or work with a certified RPO, Coretek in this instance being a RPO as well. And with us having many practitioners on board, we can help you achieve that as well based on NIST 800 171-2, 171 as a whole. So we would define the scope and specifications of systems and data that would be in scope, how we would help achieve some of the recommendations around compliance efforts there, what that would look like organizational wide, and how that can be broken out into a roadmap strategy to be able to be attained, getting into a development of plan of action and milestones, implementing security controls, document and maintain the current systems and the go forward net new systems as well based on our architecture and any template documentation and things like that we would be able to bring to the table to expedite, and what that looks like for getting individuals into a compliant delivered environment, putting together a gap assessment, what that would look like to engage a third party C3PAO, and getting into any preliminary assessments, helping you identify any gaps, getting you a plan to address said gaps, what it looks like for exemptions and mitigation of risk, and then undergoing your CMMC assessment to achieve certification. Recertification is kind of the same boat, just making sure that we're going from what do we have, how do we approach this, is there any gaps, is there any analysis, getting into what that looks like from an ongoing process, living, breathing, and doing everything under the CMMC purview and focus, and essentially cybersecurity first posture, right? So recert frequency, It's kind of laid out here in a 3-level approach. Level 1 and subset of level 2 required for annual. Level 2 requires a triannual assessment by a C3PAO, and then level 3, once again, is a triannual government level assessment. So in conclusion, key lessons to understand: benefits, enhanced cybersecurity posture. So getting into how CMMC is your enhanced cybersecurity posture start to finish, marrying that into all process documentation, all architecture, all support structure. And if you have an MSP or a contract in an MSSP, that has to extend to them as well, because they fall under that purview as an extension of you as an entity. And your org is essentially measured based on their compliance as well. And that's where Coretek leverages a CMMC enclave not only for support, but for delivery of these resources as well. So we have our own CMMC compliant enclave that we would use to deliver a CMMC enclave or support a CMMC enclave. So that way, from a RP perspective and an attestation perspective, we are meeting the same controls that you would be as well. And then getting into the competitive advantage, early CMMC certification can help position your customer or your company as a trusted partner, i.e. our customer, you guys, would be at a distinct advantage in that standpoint. And getting into your defense industrial base, potentially increasing your competitiveness for future contracts as well, for any expansion that you would want to do. And then getting you into improving your business continuity, robust cybersecurity practices. We want to help minimize downtime. We want to make sure that start to finish your IT architecture is well architected. It is able to be done in a compliancy based on your contract and controls that you fall under, but also if your services have any outages or downtimes or things of that nature, based on well-developed RPO, RTOs, we essentially will have you back up and your services back and functional, based on what would be the requirement for the business to maintain continuity. Bringing to the table some strong accountability there. CMMC does ensure robust practices. It is a tried and true methodology of being able to keep data secure. So this is where leading with this gets you in a holistic approach to your IT deployment and architecture of services. There is whistleblower protections out there. There's a program encouraging responsible disclosure of any negligent security issues, any legal safeguards for whistleblowers as well, and they can be incentivized. Potential consequences could be vast. So any non-compliance or negligent handling of any controlled data could have contractual limitations going forward, large financial penalties. There could be legal ramifications, exclusion from contracts, reputational damage to you as a company and org, and it's just not a good spot to be. So leading into what that looks like going forward, this is kind of a straightforward approach on how we get there. And the CMMC CIO website is definitely a font for knowledge to be able to track any changes or upcoming implementations, to be able to keep key and foremost compliance of CMMC across the board.
There's no questions at this time.
Okay, I was just about to say we could open it up for questions, but if we have covered all of them, we can give it a minute, see if anybody wants to shoot any in. Otherwise, that would conclude what we have to present today.
no other questions. I want to thank everyone for attending today.
I do want to thank everybody for your time as well, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to present with you, Philip. This was a good time. Enjoyed it. So, on that note, thank you, everybody. Have a good day.